Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening, and tonight we're going to be talking about more indicators of development. Last lecture, we discussed the economic indicators that tell us how developed a country is. Tonight, we're going to be looking at a variety of social indicators. Here we go. This first slide is a good review of a lot of the indicators that we have looked at throughout this year and tell us about a country's level of development. So what I would do on this slide is for each of these different items, tell us what do you think it's going to be in MDCs? What do you think it's going to be in LDCs? Birth rate tends to be lower in MDCs, higher in LDCs. So I would go through each of these, understand if you were to see these numbers, what would that tell us about the level of development in a country? So let's look at a few examples. Life expectancy, for example, gets longer as countries improve. It gets higher, it gets longer, people live longer. So in 2015, nearly 70% of the world's countries had a life expectancy above 70 years. And 15% of the world, the most developed countries in the world, had a life expectancy of more than 80 years. And literacy rates can serve as another social indicator. They're generally above 99% in very developed countries. And according to UNESCO, more than 90% of the world in 2015 was literate. That means that literacy rates are not likely to be different or all that different between core and semi-periphery countries, but will generally be the lowest in periphery countries. And even with literacy rates above 90% globally, that still leaves more than 700 million people who are not literate. Most of those individuals are female, and most live in rural areas, particularly in less developed countries. Dependency ratios are also good indicators of development, but we have to review the different types of dependency ratios. Countries that have a high elderly dependency ratio will generally have high GNI per capita, but they'll be spending a lot of that money. They'll be spending a lot of government investments, individual investments in things like elderly health care, geriatric care, elderly housing, and retirement welfare. But when it comes to youth dependency ratios, 8 of the 10 countries with the highest ratios are in sub-Saharan Africa. And those countries will often see investments, both personal and public, in things like childcare, public education, immunization programs, and healthcare for children. Speaking of healthcare for children, what we are looking at on this graphic is kind of like a population pyramid turned on its side. They are 5-year age intervals and the number of deaths for each age cohort in the year 2017. The first 5 years of life are some of the most vulnerable. In fact, in 2017, the youngest age cohort represented the most deaths by any 5-year age interval until you get over 75 years of age. That means there were more kids dying before the age of 5 than people dying in the 70 to 74 age range. And while this reflects some of the improvements that globally we have made in things like life expectancy, it underscores the need for greater protections for some of our youngest people. Infant mortality rates are considered one of the most, if not the most, telling social indicators of development because they highlight the lost potential in a country's human resources. In addition, so many things can affect a country's infant mortality rate. Malnutrition and pollution are contributing factors to pneumonia, which is the leading cause of child death. Access to vaccinations, maternal care, neonatal care, expenditures on health care, safe drinking water, sanitation and sewage systems, income inequality, levels of education, particularly for women, the mother's age at the birth of a child, among a variety of other things, all contribute to a country's infant mortality rate, which is the reason why some geographers believe that infant mortality rate is the best social indicator of development because so many things affect it. The Human Development Index is the indicator of the level of development for each country constructed by the United Nations and combines things like income, education, and life expectancy. This system was devised to combine both social and economic indicators of development to give a comprehensive view of a country's level of development. So make sure that you know the 4 components of the Human Development Index, and they are life expectancy at birth, average years of schooling measured at age 25, the expected years of schooling at the start, and GNI per capita, not GDP. They've changed them a few years ago. It used to include things like literacy rate and GDP per capita. Now, these are the 4 current ones. Please make sure that you know these 4. I could see a multiple choice question where it says, which of the following is not an indicator in the Human Development Index? So I could see that as a possibility. But the rankings of countries by the Human Development Index and income are often very similar. For example, Norway ranks first on the Human Development Index and 6th in income. The US ranks 11th on the Human Development Index and 8th when we look at income. But policies in individual countries can skew those rankings. For example, countries that invest heavily in things like education and medical care will often rank higher on the Human Development Index than they do when we just look at their income. Ireland ranks 6th on the Human Development Index, but is only 22nd when we look at their income. Cuba ranks 67th on the Human Development Index and 114th in income. So if they're spending money to invest in education and medical care, that might move them up the index compared to where their actual income is. On the other hand, some countries that are very rich in things like oil and other natural resources might rank higher in income than they do on the index. Qatar ranks first in the world when it comes to income, but they are only 32nd on the Human Development Index. Based on the comprehensive nature of the Human Development Index, this serves as one of the best indicators of a country's level of development. Notice that the countries that are at the highest end of the Human Development Index are in Anglo-America, Western Europe, particularly Northern Europe, Japan, and Australia. The least developed countries are generally in sub-Saharan Africa, but it should be noted that Afghanistan serves as a notable exception to that. This slide, and really the only note that I would really make on this, is that this is a fantastic review slide for a lot of different things that we have covered over the last 2 lectures, talking about Human Development Index, talking about core periphery model, talking about a variety of different things. This is from the AP Human Geo AMSCO prep book, and it serves as a really, really good review slide. So just make that note, like put a star next to this, come back to this when it's time to review before the AP exam and things like that. Really great review slide for a lot of the different ways that we might classify countries based on their level of development. Now, earlier this lecture, we mentioned that literacy rates are a decent indicator of development and that UNESCO predicts that about 90% of the world is literate. But again, we said that more than 700 million people are not. Now, do you remember who made up a significant portion of that more than 700 million people? Many of them are women. This leads to an important realization that development is not gender neutral, that the impacts of development affect women and men differently. And the differences in the privileges afforded to males and females in a culture are referred to as a gender gap. These differences might appear in things like educational opportunities or in employment, wages, voting rights, healthcare, political empowerment, property rights. the ability to drive a car, inheritance rights, or the right to make decisions about contraception. And there are a number of metrics that attempt to evaluate the differences between men and women when it comes to social indicators of development. One of those is the Gender Development Index, which uses the same indicators as the Human Development Index, like average years of schooling, and compares the stats for men and women within a country. Perhaps the most important metric of gender equality is the Gender Inequality Index, or GII. Generally speaking, greater gender equality is an indicator of greater levels of development. So, for example, more developed countries generally have greater gender equality, and thus gender inequality typically corresponds with lower levels of development. It's not universal, but it's a general characteristic. The Gender Inequality Index looks at health indicators like maternal mortality rates, which is the rate that women die during childbirth, and adolescent fertility rate, which examines the number of births from girls between the age of 15 and 19. Remember, we said that the age of a mother at birth is an indicator of development. It also looks at indicators of empowerment like secondary education and the share of parliamentary seats that are held by men compared to women. Finally, it includes economic factors like labor force participation rate that looks at men compared to women. Now, this is a visual that looks at those same characteristics that we just went over, those same indicators that comprise the Gender Inequality Index. But to simplify this, the Gender Inequality Index essentially comes up with a female gender index and a male gender index. The bigger the gap between those two indices, the more unequal a country is, and thus there is a greater likelihood that human development is lost due to that inequality. So let's look at the data. Denmark is 11th on the Human Development Index, but is second overall on the Gender Inequality Index, meaning that they are the second most gender equal country in the world, behind Switzerland. The composite value that a country has is a measure of the percentage of potential human development that is lost due to gender inequality. For example, Guatemala has a composite score of 0.493 compared to Sweden's score of 0.044. What that means is that there is a 49.3% loss in potential human development due to gender inequality in Guatemala, compared to only a 4.4% loss in potential human development in Sweden. Essentially, the lower the number is, the greater gender equality is. And the higher the number is, the more potential human development is lost due to gender inequality. So what about the United States? We rank 13th in the Human Development Index, but 41st when it comes to gender inequality. Compared to the other countries of the top 15 on the Human Development Index, we have the highest maternal mortality rate, the highest adolescent birth rate, the lowest percentage of parliamentary seats that are held by women, which for us would look at the Senate and the House of Representatives. But we score slightly better rankings when it looks at the percentage of women with a secondary education. We are 8th when we look at the top 15 countries. And female labor force participation rate, we are 12th out of the top 15 countries, again, on the Human Development Index. Now, in other areas of the world, gender equality would be most advanced in Europe, specifically Western Europe and, again, Northern Europe, and least advanced in West Africa, but also Southwest Asia. And that is perhaps the biggest takeaway from this conversation about gender inequality. Western Europe typically ranks towards the top in terms of development. Sub-Saharan Africa typically ranks near the bottom. But the Middle East is generally a semi-periphery region. And in terms of economics, it's on par with many other core countries of the world. But when it comes to social indicators, and in particular, gender equality, the Middle East often registers near the bottom. To look at another characteristic of gender development, it is important to notice that there are differences between male and female income throughout the world. This map looks at female income as a percent of male income. Is this a good indicator of development? Generally speaking, we can see a divide between more developed countries and less developed countries. But between core and semi-periphery, there isn't much of a divide, and there are plenty of outliers. Notice semi-periphery outliers like Mexico, Saudi Arabia. Then notice periphery countries like Mozambique, Tanzania, and Kenya. And then also notice Vietnam. These countries have fairly equal wages between men and women. So how does this matter in a globalized economy? Well, many companies are relocating manufacturing facilities from MDCs to LDCs. And female labor is often utilized because the wages are and can be significantly lower for women compared to men. So companies may prioritize countries where wages for women are significantly lower. Another metric that we can look at when it comes to gender development is labor force participation rate. In general, greater equality typically opens economic opportunities for women. Notice once again though, the Middle East, in particular Southwest Asia and North Africa. These areas have the greatest disparity between men and women in terms of participation in the workforce. But the big question is, what kind of work are people, especially women, engaging in? It often comes down to the level of development in the country. In many developing countries, periphery and semi-periphery countries, many women work as part of the informal economy. Women tend to work in the informal economy more often than do men. And it's likely that this gender difference would actually be larger if we accounted for the informal agricultural economy, for which data is not available. And this is important because governmental regulations tend to protect workers and their rights in the formal economy. And there aren't the same protections for informal workers. Taking a look at this graphic, for example, women in Uganda, over 80% of paid work outside of agriculture is informal. And there are some statistics that will put that figure at almost 95% of paid work for women being informal in Uganda. In Greece, on the other hand, that same figure is about 4%. So once again, this displays the impact that development can have and the importance of examining gender issues as a major component of development. Next lecture, we're going to dive into some of the strategies that countries utilize to try and improve social and economic indicators of development. Have a good evening, human geographers, and I'll see you next time.